Cool. Well, thanks everyone for coming out to this year's Ellipsis Lecture Series. This is the second annual lecture series that we put on here at MFG. Um, we are a creative practice specializing in multidisciplinary activities, working with clients and collaborators on projects that help push culture forward. And Ellipsis is our way of kind of reaching out and extending into the community and inviting in people that we think are doing interesting things or part of interesting things to kind of share a little bit of their perspective and kind of where design and culture is kind of going forward. Today we have Ed Urcades with us from Tlon, who will, I think, be speaking about various different topics around computing, culture, and what it's going to look like to maybe build a new internet for the future. So without further ado, Ed.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for making it out. My name is Ed, and all the information that you heard before is true. I work for this company called Tlon, and for the last, actually at this point, Urbit itself, which I'll get into in just a second, the kind of core of this project or this company, it's been in development for well over 20 years. And it really hasn't only been commercially developed up until maybe around 2015 or so. But I'll get into that in just a bit. Anyways, that's who I am. That's where I am, and I'm here to tell you all that the internet is over if you want it. And we'll get into that in just a second as to what I'm referring to here. This is a bit in jest. Obviously, the internet isn't over. Anyways, so just to sort of like open this up, when I was reflecting on just what might be interesting to talk about, I kind of want to go through some of the motions of just providing a little bit of context as to where I come from just in terms of my creative practice, how it's kind of brought me to where I am, and maybe a little bit of like a kind of light exploration of sort of some of the questions that ended up being asked along the way, and some of the half answers that I sort of stumbled upon along the way. And I figured that the best format to do that would be something a little bit nonlinear. So I opted to present a lot of the visual content of this stream through Figma, which, for those of you who aren't aware, Figma is kind of like a free form canvas application. And I can just go ahead and get right to it. Might as well. So let's start from the beginning, actually. It's probably a good place to start. So getting a little bit meta here, the prompt that sort of was offered kind of, I'm assuming to each individual who will be presenting, is this idea of explaining what it means to kind of push culture forward, and maybe unpacking that through our own practices, where we're sort of interested in terms of research. Maybe even individual topics of interest might be a way of pointing to what is something that we could conceive of pushing culture forward. And I kind of wanted to use this framing and actually adhere to it in a pretty strict way, just because in my own work, as I'll just be explaining in just a bit, I've kind of come to a set of I guess like perceptions about the world that essentially inform how I believe kind of culture is brought about, how people kind of construct it, both collectively and as an individual perhaps, and just how that kind of plays into just what I'm doing now, because I think that the two are actually quite heavily intertwined. And I'll start to kind of unpack that a little bit as I go along, but I just wanted to offer this up because it actually spoke pretty deeply to me in sort of self-framing where this is all kind of coming from. So this presentation is split roughly into three halves. I'm going to try and quickly not linger too much on just who I am and sort of what's the arc of development that brought me to what I'm doing now. I'd like to unpack a little bit of what I'm actually doing right now, the nature of my design work, who I work with, what we're working on. And then as a sort of like last thing to land on, I actually would love to unpack this idea of what it means to kind of bring about culture into the world, whether it's in the form of subcultures or pop cultures, and a bit of like, I guess maybe I'm interested in some thoughts about just how kind of, my own viewpoint sort of, maybe whether it resonates or not. We'll have to see. So just hopping right to it. Obviously, this little map is a bit of an approximation of sort of the journey that I've sort of been on up until now. So we have my arc here. Generally speaking, I could kind of encapsulate the majority of my professional experience by saying I used to do physical product design, used to do like home goods. OXO was kind of a big client back in the day. And if you've ever used a little rolly pizza cutter from them, that was somewhat my doing, as well as a variety of feather dusters and other kind of fun tchotchkes. And that was fun. And a lot of that practice of physical product design ended up actually very deeply impacting how I think about the work I do now, which is basically entirely software. And so after a bit of a mini career in physical product design, industrial design, hopped right into the sort of ocean of software in the form of IBM. Ended up realizing that large business wasn't exactly my cup of tea. Went from IBM to Tumblr, working on much more fun, playful, much smaller scale work, although still, Tumblr was Tumblr. It was quite sizable and wild in its own way. After sort of experiencing what I perceived as these two ends of the spectrum in the form of B2B and sort of more lighthearted, playful social media design, ended up working on a personal practice for a couple of years, picked up a lot of wacko clients, a lot of sort of weird work in the form of some of the really early crypto stuff that happened. Managed to do some weird R&D work for Airbnb and others along the way. And through that process of working, kind of figuring out what individual value I had to bring to the world, I ended up working with some of the designers who are good friends of mine at Tlon, and then ended up becoming a full-time designer there. And I'm still here a couple of years later. So it's really quick. It's kind of like really quick bullet points as to sort of what I'm doing now. And throughout the way, I had kind of like woven personal interests of like music making, kind of community organization. I was really big into like using Slacks and other weird software for like propping up reading clubs and stuff like that. And then like the other big through line here, which it comes to bear pretty heavily in the rest of this conversation, is this idea of what computers are, or what does it mean to compute, or kind of cracking up that definition of like what is a machine that can kind of perform computation. So kind of following this flow chart rightward and zooming in a bit, nested within Tlon, which is where I'm embedded right now, we're basically a series of sort of just like really heavily applied work. We're working on something pretty serious here, as I'll get into it just a bit. But it's also like really weird and abstract and sometimes hard to pin down work. What we are doing at Tlon is in fact building a new sort of internet is one way of putting it. A new personal computer is another way of putting it. I'll get a little bit more concrete about that in just a second. But underlining all of this was sort of this broader theme that, what we are trying to do is effectively build a new computer from scratch, which is quite an abstract problem for a variety of reasons. For those of you who are aware of what a computer are, you might be using it now to watch this. Computers are these things that you can, install other sort of software on, like work applications or video games, and you can usually just use them and kind of multiplex them and like make use of this thing in really rich ways. And I think that one of the things to deeply realize about the current state of computers is that nearly every single type of computer that is in popular use today is the result of over 7 decades of research and development. And as a result, the computers these days are 7 decades of basically history, right? There's this sort of a saying with people who use certain operating systems that, often these things feel like big balls of sort of mud. They're kind of like indecipherable. When you're trying to kind of pick through this thing, it's just like it's a big ball of yarn. And it's kind of hard to kind of tease apart what exactly a computer is these days because they're so old and quite big. And, even shiny things like iPhones, for example, or even, Vision Pro or Reality Pro or whatever Apple is calling it these days. Even these really cutting edge products are built on very old foundations. And that's something worth sort of reflecting on or unpacking. And this is to say that reflection and unpacking of that reality is in fact the nature of the work that we're doing at Tlon. And this is all sort of just, me trying to kind of skirt around some of the details here and just offer up a bit of a summary. But in my own understanding of my own work, given this context, a lot of what I've been kind of construing as my own work is trying to kind of approximate what does it mean to kind of like be a person on the internet or using a networked computer or a social, platform or a social network. What does it mean to be a person on a network? What does it mean to kind of be treated like a person or kind of be provided affordances that allow you to act like a person? It's like if it wasn't for the stream, I could hop on this desk, I could jump around, I can, run from one side of the building to the other side of the building, and reflecting really deeply on what exactly you are afforded to do on a platform like Instagram or even in something like HTML. It's worth asking yourself, what exactly are you allowed to do, and kind of how can you sort of move yourself through these systems? And that's how, in kind of the journey of coming to working on what I'm working on, a lot of what I'm trying to think about and kind of reason about and materialize in a very concrete way is how to use the mediums of computers and computation to approximate being a person on the internet and being able to do things that are kind of that a full person can do, in their physical bodies. And how does that kind of contribute to the making of new cultures through kind of these successfully kind of nesting mediums? So that went a little bit longer than I was hoping to. I'm starting to unpack and get a little bit into what I want to talk about here, but that's kind of a very rough summary of sort of where I came from, what things kind of affected my frame of mind and way of thinking about these various problems, and just kind of where I'm landed now. And what's worth sort of actually doubling down on is the fact that these are all kind of a series of successive questions that were kind of cracked open at each step of the way, professionally, so to speak. As a physical product designer, it's like asking yourself, oh, what does it mean to make a physical thing that looks beautiful and actually feels good in your hand? To, learning about what, a 300,000 person company, effectively the size of a small country, like what does it mean to kind of navigate that and sort of make work in contexts like that? To, Tumblr and Tumblr being Tumblr, lots of weird things to work out there. And even things like deriving self-worth from sort of working as a freelancer. And so there's a bit of a second sort of stage to this description of like, who am I? Who's this guy that's, blabbing on your computer? And I think in sort of the, the quick way that you can, do with Post-its, just can offer up just a series of kind of rapid fire realizations from a lot of this work that, through the, the design of physical products, that being in a body is everything. Whether you are in a wheelchair, whether you can walk, whether you can't walk, people have bodies, and bodies are capable of doing a variety of things, much vaster than most of us can even imagine. And that it's really important to kind of consider the ability for you to kind of like navigate the world using this vessel that is yourself. It's really important to take that very seriously, even in the design of software and kind of more ethereal or abstract sort of, structures. Let's see, I threw in there that mass production is probably good, but I can leave that as an aside. I learned through, IBM that like B2B isn't necessarily where my heart is at. And in sort of the various kind of projects that I was doing kind of in the bowels of IBM, that surveillance of the mass sort is probably not that great for society. And as a fun asterisk here, being within IBM and working on sort of, mesh networks for like sensing people in like Macy's is actually how I learned about Urbit. And so in a sense, the vehicle of IBM and kind of working on this very particular type of technology, sensing people, tracking them through environments, ended up informing some of my own ideas as to how something like Urbit could be a way out, or possibly another option or another way of going about building technology. Through the process of working at Tumblr, learn that smaller scale social media actually isn't any better than sort of like mass deployed, hyper business, accounting software or tracking software. Even the sort of smaller scale social networks that are out there, there are some really interesting mechanisms in play for how attention is siphoned off. Just ways of sort of like trying to kind of compress who you are as a person to something very flat into a row in a database is what we like to say often in the Urbit world. Is that most of the time when you're using a service or using the internet, you're ending up flattened into something that is just a line in a database. And then, through this medium as well, learn that, working with really cool people, really weirdo people was actually something that I cherished very deeply. And working at Tumblr and the design team there is probably one of the coolest design teams I've ever been involved with. So that was great. And as a result of that, learned that, good organizational design is everything. Got to do that well. So you all, for those of you who are freelancers or creative types of any sort who do self-directed work or client-based work, just I'm sure this is something you all are already well aware of, but just do weird projects, do things that are self-directed, kind of figure out what you yourself are interested in bringing value to the world is huge. So that was a huge learning of mine. And then sort of some of the other answers here, I think, in this sort of answer half to the description about me was this idea that, reflecting on this sort of various contexts that I had worked in, this project called Urbit, on which Tlon works on, is probably one of the very, very rare actual from scratch reconsiderations of how technology works that I have ever encountered in the kind of span of things that I've been lucky to work on. It's really important to sort of like to realize, I think, when certain technologies are kind of like putting you on a path that is going in a direction that may not be good. And then sort of some other answers that are related to the previous questions that I had come across in my working life is this idea that interfaces are your body. And I mean that in kind of a very literal sense, in the fact that, when you perceive others in a digital environment, the interfaces that are provided you, liking, retweeting, whatever, those sort of circumscribe how you can be you, or like you can be a person on the internet. And so there's that really famous video of the main character from A Clockwork Orange strapped to a chair, eyes like, pried open, forced to watch like some psyop or whatever. And that's you on Twitter, that's you on Instagram. You don't have control of a body when you're using these platforms. You are in control of like a drone that can only reblog and can only do X, Y, and Z things. And that sucks. And there's got to be a better way. And as a sort of like final sort of like, okay, this is the point that I'm trying to hammer in here is this idea that, culture is something that isn't constructed by drones. It's not constructed by artificial beings that can only like things or retweet them or reblog them or pin them to or bookmark them to like a feed. Culture is it's a people thing, it's something that's made by you and I. It's made by groups of people interested in really cool things or things that they're just kind of like doing together. And so I guess like a kind of long thesis that I'm drawing out in my own work is this idea that when you're thinking about what culture is and what it means to produce it, you require personhood to actually do that. So in a sense, you require the kind of manifestation of an actual body through which you can kind of fully act as a person in whatever capacity you'd like to. And that's kind of the sort of like atomic bits that make up for how culture is constructed, bit over bit, person by person, act by act. It requires kind of a fullness of self in order to do that. And I guess like the big thesis here with a lot of the work that we're doing is that, unless you really own your computation, which is kind of a form of self, you can't really build anything that's lasting or truly personal. What we call personal computers, these shiny devices by Apple and whatever, they aren't actually personal computers. They are highly beautiful, highly capable, general purpose machines that allow you to act in very specific ways. And our big thesis is that there's got to be a better way. So that's a bit about me and kind of the various things that are driving me kind of question and answer wise. And materially, I'd just like to get into why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, what is the work that I'm doing, and how does it sort of in its own way address some of these ideas as to, what does it mean to kind of evoke personhood online, or what does it mean to kind of build a personal computer from scratch? So we'll just get into that. This is where I'm going to read off the screen a little bit. I think it's important to actually kind of, express some of the points about Urbit quite precisely, given its weirdness and some of its abstractness. So Urbit, what is that? What the hell is this thing? In a slightly technical nutshell, Urbit is basically a virtual operating system, and it is an answer, or a possible answer, one answer of potentially many, of the problem that is personal computing. In personal computing, in the sense that you have these systems that can do things for you that you can be yourself on, but with systems like Mac OS or Windows or Linux, the underlying computation is really obscure. It's huge. It's 7 decades old, and there's a lot going on there that you yourself, as sort of the average person, programmer or not, there's only so little you can do with that. So one point of sort of it's worth underlying here is that Urbit is a virtual operating system. It's virtual like an emulator of a physical Nintendo Game Boy is virtual. Right now, Urbit is almost like an emulated alien operating system that can be sort of loaded as a layer on top of your Mac OS machine or your Windows machine or Linux machine. You can even run it on a Raspberry Pi. But it's worth noting that Urbit itself is kind of this overlay of a sort. It's almost like when you have gravel and you pave over it with concrete or with asphalt to make a car go better. Urbit is a way of paving over a lot of this abstraction and kind of offering up a very minuscule, very simple machine. And so while Urbit isn't a physical computer yet, it is in fact almost a computer working in reverse, where the result of the computers that we use right now, even our shiny iPhones, are basically all evolved from these, room-sized machines back in DARPA and Stanford, in the 50s and 60s. And so we had to work from that point of these room-sized machines to slightly smaller, table-sized machines up until the phones that we have in our pockets now. And one really good way to think about Urbit is that it's working from the abstraction of software as a virtual computer that can be kind of described in a very, very small, compact way. And you can almost imagine that one goal of Urbit might be to slowly work its way to crystallizing into a physical computer, at least as some people would like to describe it. And there actually are some people in the ecosystem, not me or not the people that I work with, who are working on making physical Urbits. So it's worth noting that there's an interesting story here. Some other quick facts about Urbit that are kind of interesting and just kind of inform where it's coming from is that it started off as a garage project around 20 years ago. It preceded Ethereum, it preceded Bitcoin, and essentially all other crypto projects as most people know them. In its own kind of idiosyncratic way, Urbit was it was a project of approaching computing from the perspective of how someone from Mars or like an alien civilization might design a language in like a stack of computation, like all the languages and things that make up a computer. So it's kind of like like an acid trip of a computer project, so to speak. And because of that, it's quite weird in some respects. But at the same time, it's very deeply reasoned out. I think when people, especially technical people who first encounter Urbit, look at the programming language that's written in, they're kind of taken aback. They're like, what the heck is this thing? This looks wacky as hell. But taking a step back, if you're a non-programmer and you're looking at any code, it looks like gibberish. And so there's a lot to do with Urbit that I think is even more weird to people who are used to computers as they are now, but might be so weird for people who are new to programming or new to computers. So like I said, Urbit is a 20-year-old project, but it's only really been professionally developed for kind of public consumption since around 2015 or 2016. I had joined full-time in 2019, so it was even before my time that Tlon, the company, started trying to make Urbit, this kind of garage project, into something that could actually run on people's computers, could provide visual interfaces for you to work with, and so on and so forth. Some other sort of more nerdy facts. These aren't maybe the most interesting thing if you don't really care about this stuff, but it's worth noting that Urbit's entire goal is to take these 7 decades of computation and computer history and all that sort of debt of knowledge and just all the piles of people's work that's built up over those years. And it's trying to sort of do away with that in the name of simplicity, at least to try to think about how you could do this thing from, a core sort of like from scratch principle. And in the act of doing this, Urbit is actually as a sort of very uniform kind of core of computation, like what actually describes the computer at this lowest level. It can fit on a t-shirt. I wish I wore it today so I could like spin around and show you, but it's something that can actually fit, sub 20 lines of code on a single t-shirt, while equivalent descriptions of computers number in like the 30K lines or so, or there's like hundreds of instruction sets for Linux. And these systems are just like, they're huge, and Urbit is quite tiny. I actually meant to say that Urbit itself has a total project is around somewhere from like 30 to 50,000 lines of code. This is contrasting it with systems like Linux, which is like hundreds of instructions and has like 8 million lines of code. It's literally a system that no individual human could actually comprehend. It has to be sort of nudged along by teams of people, so to speak. And then another kind of fun fact about Urbit as sort of description of a computer as like a new computer project is that unlike a lot of versioning systems that seek to kind of be like, hey, we're fancy new version 2, fancy new version 3, etc., they only grow in complexity, they grow in size. There's a really interesting anachronistic element of Urbit in that, and then this is a point that's argued in the ecosystem, that the versioning system actually counts down. So that the goal, maybe it's decades down the line, maybe it's hundreds of years down the line, is that Urbit eventually actually stops evolving. The core of it becomes so sort of crystal clear in its definition that you can kind of use it as an eternal reference point for how to build things like apps or networks or whatever on top of it. And this is weird to a lot of people to hear because you expect software to update like infinitely, because that's just what we're used to. But when you conceive of physical objects out in the world, like bricks or like the I-beam, the thing that they used to build skyscrapers, these things have really hard definitions. And they're more or less baked, so to speak. If these things were to change, a lot of existing standards out in the world would also crumble because the world is built on standards in some sense, for better or for worse. And so there's this acknowledgement that in seeking to eventually crystallize over time, Urbit ideally becomes something that is rock solid, like a really solid firmament from which you can build a lot of other richer things that maybe do increase in versioning. But Urbit itself as like a core bit of computation is just this thing that should eventually become like a rock. Very, very reliable, very standard, and as simple as possible. So that's Urbit. It's a bit of sort of the technical background to what I'm doing at Tlon, which actually seeks to kind of paper over that, not paper over it, but like get to the interesting bit, which is, well, what can you do on Urbit? Why is it interesting? Why would I use Urbit when a MacBook exists, or when Twitter or Facebook exists? And I'm here to answer that. So what about Tlon? What is Tlon? What is this company that I work at? Tlon is a company that exclusively had stewarded and incubated Urbit as an open source project only up until about a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago or so. It's kind of a bit of a spectrum. Tlon is now an independent company that approaches software development sort of like how Muji approaches home goods. For those of you who are not familiar with Muji, Muji is almost like the Kirkland or the Target of Japan. They make unbranded goods. They're simple. To some people, they're beautiful. To some people, they're boring. But what's actually deeply interesting about Muji is not even necessarily the products they make, but it's the context from which the company emerged from. Muji was established in 1980 at the height of sort of the Japanese economic bubble, when things are really ostentatious, things are really crazy, very maximal, lots of color and advertising. Sony was producing like really wild headsets at the time, and companies were just going crazy. They're just making all sorts of things. And the people who started Muji took a step back, addressed that kind of economic and that greater social situation, they were like, I don't know, is this actually good? Is this actually, respecting people's homes? Is it kind of imbuing you with a sense of calmness in your life or whatever? And they kind of sought to very intentionally situate their work and the nature of what they did as a physical product developing company to make things that almost kind of faded into the background of your home. Things that were almost like vessels that you could fill with your life, like actual boxes and things that just kind of didn't really call too much attention to themselves. So there's a really funny parallel in Tlon and Muji. It's kind of a bit of a theme that we one of the many things that we explore in our design work, in that we live in a world of sort of highly ostentatious software. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on. A lot of people being really maximal about this work. Everything has to look like a rave poster these days, which is sick. I love a good rave. But when you imagine like a home full of like rave posters and everything's kind of like throbbing, the lights are on and everything's a strobe light, it gets to be a lot. And a lot of the software that we are surrounded with these days evokes kind of a very similar, almost like assault of your senses. And so in the same way that Muji kind of addressed this scenario and decided to kind of go counter to it, a lot of our work at Tlon, and more specifically the design work, seeks to kind of evoke a little bit of a calm space, or kind of like a place for reprieve or contemplation, even with the work that we're doing. So we're a team of 30 people, team of 3 designers, myself included. Just going to zoom through this because some of the work is maybe more exciting to look at than my face and text on a screen. You could construe our latest software as being a suite of digital basics, with this flagship project approximating a group chat OS. We call it Groups. It's very simple. And Groups is basically like a Discord or a Slack without all the bullshit. And one of the things that we'll be releasing quite soon is quite unique in my opinion, but it's this idea of channel types that can kind of be slotted in and out and be made to express much deeper things than just text chat or linear chat. And so there's a couple of links I could hop into now. I'm actually, let's see, I think I'm actually doing okay on time. So maybe it's worth jumping into just some of the overall vibe of the work that we do. For those of you who use Arena, we're good pals with the people at Arena, highly aligned. And a lot of our work is on Arena right now. If you were to search for Tlon, a lot of the work that is in this graphic explorations channel is by Romina, one of my colleagues. Her work is amazing, but you can just kind of quickly get a sense of like the type of work that we do, the type of memes or mimetic sort of like ideas we like to put out into the world. We love the outdoors. We're into monochromatic print, sort of very tactile work. We're into the idea of creating secret societies and strange subcultures. We love a good flower. Love the outdoors. I already said that. But you kind of find a lot of these themes weaving themselves through our work. This idea that there is kind of a sublime beauty to be captured through the form of computation, what computation represents. And there's almost like a naturalism or kind of this awareness that computers or internets or these highly technical things can be much simpler and kind of inject themselves much more naturally into your life. And I could just go on and on with some of the work that we've done, but I don't want to spend too much time here. For those of you who are interested, then feel free to visit and check out what we're all about. There's a lot there. So that's us. That's kind of our vibe. Let's see, what did I want to share? I think this is actually where I get to kind of hop into some of the actual work that we're currently doing right now, which is always fun to work through. And this kind of gets a little bit to the overall question that I am interested in, which is how do you kind of construct a body online or an approximation of a physical body? Our product that I described, Groups, is a great case in point of sort of this thesis in its own very specific way. I'm sure a lot of you in the crowd are aware of what Discord is. When you really inspect what Discord is, when you really take a second to kind of take a step back and check out what you're looking at, you're assaulted with all sorts of information, all sorts of badges, all sorts of statuses, lots of emoji, This is the lo-fi girl kind of chill wave Discord. And while lo-fi chill wave study YouTube is chill and kind of calm for all intents and purposes, even the manifestation of this community in this software is noisy as hell, busy as hell. It really doesn't respect you as a person, in my opinion. And so, in acknowledging that a lot of software is highly noisy, really busy, really distracting, a lot of the nature of our work is to kind of take these ubiquitous software patterns, and I mean that in a very broad way, just DMing someone, one-to-one chat is a pattern of sorts. Group chat could be conceived of as a pattern of how you use a computer. Groups is our idea of the pattern of sort of multi-channel based communication like Discord or Slack, but taking this idea a lot more seriously, thinking about it through the lens of what an operating system is and allows you to do. And a lot of the work that we do is to try to kind of manifest this idea of respecting you and your time, you and your senses, and to actually make it at the same time more rich and more interesting. In this case, we're looking at an approximation to Discord. This looks like a Discord, maybe it smells like a Discord, who knows? You see channels, you see a bit of branding for the group. Each of these channels is representative of not only a text chat, but of a possible media collection, like a gallery of photos, like an arena, like a Pinterest. And then, like I just kind of flashed on screen, one of the other channels that we offer in our product is this idea of long form writing, or being able to write notes with a group of people. And so already you're starting to get a really interesting sense of, okay, well, if I think about my group as just this sort of set of slots, if you will, that I can kind of inject software into, you start to get into a little bit of where we're going with this product, in the sense that we'd like to open this up so that you as a developer or someone who's interested in sort of this something that approximates the shape of a Discord, but does a lot more than that, you should be able to kind of, build out a digital life or sort of a sense of selfhood or community within this thing. Maybe you want something that approximates a Discord, but doesn't have a single chat inside of it. Maybe it's just a bunch of galleries. Perhaps it's a series of notes that you're writing up with some friends. Maybe every single channel here, instead of a text chat, is a Minecraft channel, or like a server for a game, for those of you who played things like Team Fortress. The idea is that you can take something like a Discord, that pattern of software, and begin to do much more interesting things with it. And a lot of this is only possible in a world where you actually own your computation. You can't walk into Discord and say, hey, I want to take Minecraft and I want to plop it right in here and just play, Minecraft with the list of members in that group. That sounds amazing, but you just can't do that with any software that exists today. And what we're trying to build at Tlon, using Urbit as our foundation, is a world where, because you and your friends in Urbit each are on their own computer, and you're computing things in a kind of very highly direct manner, peer-to-peer, as we like to call it, you get into a really interesting world where the kind of computation that you can perform in highly familiar patterns or shapes, like a Discord, becomes much more rich. So what I'm kind of offering you all right now is a look into some of the work that we're doing now that basically provides a set of digital basics for you as a person hopping into our work: chat, long form text, and something that approximates photo galleries. But some of the more interesting work that we're kind of conceiving of is, well, what happens if you can play games inside of a group? And this is some work being done by a group called Vaporwave in the Urbit ecosystem. For those of you who've were old enough to use Neopets when you were a kid, what if you could have a navigable world or an omelet, channel type within your group? Or maybe you are old school and you love a good forum, or maybe you enjoy Reddit or any other software of a similar shape. The idea that we'd like to bring to bear is this idea that using groups as somewhat of a vessel, you can kind of insert software experiences that you actually care about, that manage to kind of respect you and the way that you kind of operate in a computer and the people that you use a computer with. And we're hoping that you can build worlds with this thing that we're offering. this is kind of a fun example to land on as well, which is this idea of like a magic 8-ball channel type, a channel that only does one thing. It gives you a prediction. That would be cool too. So some other examples here. Maybe even raw HTML has a future on Urbit as a channel type. Who knows? When you're building a computer, anything is possible. So 9:46. I actually think that that's a good place to end. Kind of nicely kind of ties up what we're doing right now, the work that we're all kind of collectively building at Tlon. And what's kind of wild about all this is that this isn't a fantasy. This isn't, I'm not showing you inert Figma screens just because that's all we have. Urbits are things that you can run right now. Like I said, you can run them on a Raspberry Pi. You can actually run them on a local device. But a lot of what we're doing at Tlon specifically is to try to make using Urbit easier. This is the current version of like the kind of root of the operating system we're developing. It's almost like Nintendo Switch. Very simple, and we're shipping really, really wild updates to this soon. Each of these is like an individual app that I've installed to my Urbit. So this is an example of something one of my teammates, Hunter, built. It's kind of like Pastebin, like a place to basically write arbitrary text. You can kind of like write notes to yourself, and that just works. It's just kind of something that works on Urbit. Pals is a fun one. People like to extend Pals and do weird things with it. It's kind of like a contact list, like a list of being able to see who your pal is, who isn't your pal, who's added you. And there are a lot of fun projects that people have been developing with pals, such as the ability to like see people on a map, or sort of propagate rumors throughout small networks of pals, sort of gossip style. And then the things that we're working on, Groups and Talk, is kind of what I would call our flagship work. This exists right now. It approximates a Slack or a Discord if you've ever used it. And we kind of use it as you would use any one of these platforms. We're building something akin to a design guild called Structure on Urbit, using groups as kind of the grounds through which we sort of chat about design on Urbit and what it means to design interfaces and ecosystems on Urbit. At Tlon, we actually use it for work day to day, just like people use Slack often. One of the communities that we're actually building up and kind of cultivating for people who are new to Urbit is this place called Tlon Local. And you can see here that since I last checked this out before this call, there's been a couple of messages to it. But it's, as I'd like to kind of describe it, it's just kind of a software that is just a little bit more respectful and kind of aware of interesting ways to use computers. And it's only going to get better as we do more with it. So yeah, this all exists now. The last thing I wanted to kind of offer up to anyone who's interested, or if this piques anyone's interest, let me go back to Figma, is basically, if any of you all want to talk to me on this weirdo new internet, help, think about interesting ways to make use of it, you can just go to tlon.io. It's the same thing as this QR code on screen, but maybe that's easier for you. But I find that the best way to sort of experience Urbit or the work that we're doing at Tlon is just to use it. It sounds abstract. It sounds kind of like weird and crazy and like, oh, why is this thing so impenetrable? Or at least it used to. But these days you can get a very quick idea of what exactly listing is possible when you start talking to people on the network and seeing what they're building on it and seeing what we're building on it, So I think that's it. I think that's where I could leave this off on. I'm happy to answer questions or open it up to anyone interested. So I think that's it.
Cool. Lyman, you got a question?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ed. As Tlon kind of starts to re-examine a lot of this technology and build a new personal server, have you guys spent some time thinking about how to build a company from scratch and like what that should look like? And I'm specifically interested in how you build a design team. Like, what does hierarchy look like for Tlon? What does direction look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. I will say right off the bat that Tlon, despite the nature of it working on something quite wild and really new in terms of just its structural kind of approach, I should say, it's a pretty traditional company as it stands. It's It's kind of run in a way where, you know, we have teams working on various aspects of the product. Right now, everything is quite mean and lean, I should say. You know, we have like a group of 3 people max working on the mobile and the web sort of expressions of our software. So we're doing a lot with a little right now. And I think in service to kind of the classic lean kind of company, you know, just approach, a lot of what we're doing isn't as, I guess, like, to kind of get to what you're asking, it isn't novel in the sense that with a distributed, you know, network, you can do distributed things or distribute work, or kind of work, I guess, like in a bit more of a broad sense, not even just like the work that we do, but just like kind of what is contributed to the network. That's something that we kind of approach in a pretty like standard, really lean, really focused way, which isn't to speak for the ecosystem, which I think is what I think is maybe a better lens to which to view your question, which is that there are people on the network right now who are doing really weird things with Urbit, the ecosystem, through the vehicle of other kind of crypto platforms. The structure example I offered is our design guild of sorts on Urbit. It's actually run on an Urbit that's collectively owned by like 12 people in the group through something called a multi-sig wallet, which for those of you who aren't crypto aware or don't care about this stuff, it's kind of a way for a group of people to like own assets together. It's like a shared wallet basically. And so that group itself, it's like, well, at Tlon, we're running things in kind of like a standard way, so to speak. Structure is this interesting example of us trying to think about how sort of distributing ideas and actual compute sort of maps to the group of people who are actually kind of using the software itself to build up those organizational affordances or boundaries or what have you. So that's actually something that like right now is like a work in progress. I can't really offer up a concise answer here for you that is like nice and packaged. Like structure, there are other people on Urbit who are doing things in kind of really kind of weird ways. Some DAOs emerging. Again, for those of you not crypto aware, it's kind of distributed autonomous organizations, in quotes, because each of those words have different weighings according to the DAO that you're talking to. But there are a lot of people trying out interesting organizational experiments, so to speak. Hopefully that kind of like offers a bit of a multi-dimensional way of answering your question. But I can get into it more if you'd like.
No, that's great. Could you offer any insight on like kind of the day-to-day, specifically with a small team of 3 designers? Like, how do you split time between Tlon spends a lot it seems like Tlon is at the forefront of like marketing Urbit as like an idea, not just like, you know, your app or like your new kind of OS or whatever. It's like, you know, talk about Urbit but obviously you're also doing interface design. So how do you split that? How are you thinking about that on your team?
No, that's a really good question. There's an interesting thing to unpack there, which is that while Tlon, I think, had a pretty heavy say in the way that Urbit, the sort of open source project was marketed, while that may have been true anywhere up until 2 years to maybe a year ago, at this point, actually, maybe this kind of goes to your first question. There was a bit of an interesting organizational happening in which the responsibilities of maintaining Urbit, the open source kind of very broad project, was actually disentangled from the concerns of Tlon, or vice versa. Tlon was disentangled from Urbit, the open source project. So getting back to your question, there was a bit of a period where we kind of had to figure between these 2 organizations, oh man, who's handling what? And so I think to answer your question partially, while I would say that at one point Tlon was maybe had the most weight in determining what Urbit was, and at that time a lot of people thought of Urbit as like, oh, the calm computer project. I wouldn't say that actually, I mean, it isn't something maintained now. The Urbit Foundation has a very kind of specific, much more general purpose, kind of more broad, like, hey, the developers, hey, people in the world, here's how this weird new computer thing can be used across varieties of technological projects, whether you're a developer or not, or a podcaster or whatever. The work that we're doing at Tlon, kind of calm computing, quiet computing, Muji computing, whatever you want to call it, that's just one flavor. And now there are many people kind of offering up different ways of kind of construing the project that is Urbit. We have people developing war games on Urbit. kind of like a turn-based kind of like tank battling game. That doesn't calm at all. That gets really crazy. Gaming in general can be quite rambunctious. And so I think we're at a really interesting point in that we can kind of maintain this vision of what we do and the design work that we care about, and the voice of sort of like circumscribing the work that we do, and kind of keep that nice and intact. And I guess like strong is one way to put it, while other people are able to kind of take this generic thing and kind of make it theirs. And there are a lot of other companies developing really cool, I guess, like voices for what this new computer project can be. So at this point, ours is just one out of this kind of like new ecosystem of people rising up to make this thing their own. So that's one part of your question. As far as like how this all kind of comes to bear in our own day-to-day design work, like I said, our design team is 3 people right now. It's myself, it's Romina, who I introduced briefly, and Dan Brewster, who is someone that I'm working very closely with and actually working on and developing the actual product side of Tlon's work. While Romina is also contributing to kind of like the branding and the look and feel of some of these kind of products, like voice, like she is kind of more involved in sort of like the marketing, communications, and the overall kind of like Tlon brand, qual brand, like just it as like an abstraction, as like a corporate abstraction, how that is communicated to people. And of course, we have like an entire communications team that's also has kind of a large say in how this work that we do is voiced and how it is self-defined. And I guess like the best way to sort of describe how these things follow or how they're arranged is that in a really kind of interesting way, a lot of the work that we do is informed by kind of the overall affordances of Urbit itself. And the way that I've termed this before, kind of talked about it to others, is this, it's almost like we're following the grain of the infrastructure, right? So if you think about like wood, for example, it has a grain. And if you try to do things against that grain or try to like, chisel it a certain way, you're just gonna end up with a mess because things fray and splinter in unexpected ways. And so with something like Urbit, for anyone who's like hopping on now, or will hop on it soon, or has used it before, there are some elements of it that are a little bit weird. And even as someone who's like expecting Twitter, or Facebook sort of performance, some things are a little slow, some things are a little clunky. And so when Dan and I are working through the various design problems that we have in terms of just interfaces and how to express them, there's a lot of working with the grain that we have to do to basically ensure that our work feels at home in the context that is this new computer that isn't fully performant in the ways that some people would expect it to. So there's a very direct correlation between what Urbit, the technical machine virtual computer thing, is able to do, and ideally, like Tlon's kind of very specific design point of view on how that's given kind of a physical form, so to speak, or a visual form, is to kind of be true to that. To not try to pretend it's something else, to not try to pretend it's like a shiny, Apple device or an Apple machine of any sort. It's to tell you as the person using this thing in our work that, hey, you're encountering a very particular sort of object. And that's the thing that we're trying to communicate to you. And so this comes, I think, to bear much more directly in the product work that we do. I like to hope that the product design that we do is able to kind of manifest what I'm describing, but even in the work that Romina is doing, or the various people who write, kind of and give voice to the actual kind of the actual branding and kind of like communications work that we do, there's this idea of kind of being true to the grain of the infrastructure that Urbit represents that we're very interested in as a company, I'd say. I almost could say at this point that you could see this as like a company value, is that kind of being true to the form or the material that I think we're collectively interested in, engineering and marketing and design and et cetera, everyone alike. And I can only hope that that's kind of what ends up being communicated in the work that we do. Sorry, I'm like unpacking this bit by bit, and I'm hoping I'm addressing the original questions. In terms of like how we actually execute this day to day, this design team has kind of evolved over the years. The current team of 3 people was not always 3 people, worked with really amazing people in the past. And over the years, we've kind of developed a little bit of an internal sense of structure for how to communicate design and kind of nestle it into existing work as a service to the rest of the company. And right now things operate in a pretty standard way where, because of how small the team is, there isn't a lot of kind of, bureaucratic kind of, machinery put into place. We have pretty standard, stand-ups at the beginning and end of the week. We have a crit schedule that we adhere to pretty strictly, just because crit is eternally important. And each of us are embedded in each of our respective teams in engineering or comms or otherwise that we work with the most. So like I said, kind of to the point about Tlon being a pretty standard company for its current positioning, even our design work isn't exactly fantastical or wild or wacky. It's pretty lean and pretty straightforward, I would say. I think the weirdest thing about the work that we do is that we actually conduct most of it through Urbit itself. We haven't used things like Telegram or Slack or Discord or whatever for over 3 or 4 years. Like, it's all basically been through Urbit, with exception to things like email or Google Docs or whatever,
I had one question as you were kind of going through and breaking down the sort of the way that, design and marketing and information and like the mission of the company is being kind of broadcast to people. Like, one of the things that was kind of wasn't so like clearly described is like this idea of audience, especially when you're talking about accessibility and personhood, and these being like very important sort of like foundational terms that this thing's being built around. Like, so who is the audience that you are trying to communicate to now, if at all? Like, who are you building this thing for? What, like, who is Urbit for?
Yeah, I mean, I can now absolutely offer you sort of my own kind of personally scoped opinion there, because I don't want to necessarily speak on behalf of the company in kind of any official manner. I just want to make sure that's very clear. But I will say that what I approximate as being a really good kind of demographic or sort of like addressee for the work that we're doing are basically people who find themselves kind of operating at the scale of something like a book club, or maybe a small business, a small design consultancy, or even something like a group chat, with some friends. I think that kind of scale of something from around like a small grouping of people to kind of a smaller community, a smaller club, maybe even something that gets into the possibly like the low hundreds of people. I would surmise that our product is probably the most comfortable to people kind of in that scale. But this, in its current stage, the work that we're doing at Tlon isn't something that you could like foist off to Figma or Stripe and say, hey, massive company, use this thing. That just wouldn't make any sense. And companies like Slack and such are highly aligned to that kind of enterprise like level of scale. And so I guess like maybe I could like leave it there, is that kind of like smaller organizational unit seems like a really solid sweet spot for the work that we're doing right now. There's a lot of work to be done, of course, but to make it scale a little bit more to slightly larger groups, or maybe even the individual as kind of like someone who's just using a computer by themselves. But I would say that the majority of our work is something that feels a lot more comfortable when you're doing with a small group of people. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. I actually think that like the case of something like a book club is actually kind of a fun example too. I've always had kind of a more personal dream through the vehicle of Urbit of kind of reinventing what a book means in the context of like a shared kind of like computational resource. Like, it's like, just to expand on that a little bit, just to kind of get to the theme of some of what I was describing earlier, is that you have this idea of a book, right? I don't know, what's a good book? The Hobbit or something. I don't know. This McMaster Carr manual that I have on my desk. This idea of like ebooks and kind of reading books on the internet right now is really isolated. You're doing it by yourself in terms of just what the experience is, and even the affordances that Kindle offers, where it underlines something that 300 people underlined as well. It just feels weird. It feels kind of creepy. It was always my dream to kind of think about how you would take something like a book and almost use that as a medium through which you would perform Discord-like or Slack-like capabilities, almost like where rather than channels and a view of a chat being your main interface, it would be the pages of a book, where you'd be like, oh yeah, I want to talk about, or like have a show and tell on page 33 of The Hobbit, Or I'd like to like highlight this word Gandalf and start like, a gallery on that. There's some really interesting and kind of like really wacky ideas that I deeply believe are only possible with the medium that we're working through right now. And kind of books and book clubs are like a really fun example of that, actually. Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions?
Yeah, Ed.
Yeah.
So one of the things I picked up, so first of all, a lot of this is really interesting. I've never thought of basically the age of the computer and it being something that's like 70 years old. So that was like a really cool thing just to think about. But as you were talking, so one of the things that I think is like really beautiful about an app like Instagram is its simplicity and how, you don't need to train someone on how to use Instagram. At what point do things in Urbit get a little bit too specified to where it's like there needs to be a whole education around learning the system?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I will say selfishly that like the aim of a lot of the work that we're doing at Tlon is to make, this really complex and highly technical and abstract object that is a virtual computer, something you actually don't really need to think about. I would go as far as saying that in an ideal world, which might not an ideal world. Actually, I want to reframe that. I think that the work that we're doing at Tlon would be really cool if it was just like about the work that we do and not even about Urbit. Not as like a slight to Urbit or saying like, we don't care about you, go away. It's just this idea that like the interesting about Urbit are sort of the opportunities that it gives you as a developer on the platform or as a person building a company, or in our case, people interested in developing sort of social software that you can actually do really cool things in. And so for me, and I would surmise for most people at Tlon, the idea is that you should never have to, give someone a manual or try to prove to them why Urbit software is better. It just needs to be better, period. What I'm describing to you, like what's on my screen now, like my ideal, I'm not saying that this is true right now. I'm not telling you all to feel this way, but ideally this looks and feels way, way, way better to use than Discord. Ideally, it feels way nicer to use to build a community or start a book club in Slack, just purely on those grounds. Like this software should just look nice. It should feel nice. You shouldn't have to learn how to use it or like be kind of like bought into the Urbit, cult or whatever to understand why it's good. Like it should just be good. I would say that that's kind of like the framing for a lot of the way that we're kind of talking about our work and starting to frame it these days. That it's just got to be good software,
And you're like getting my brain going like deeper and deeper as we talk more, because you're talking about like software needing to be good, but then also it's like how can software kind of reflect back like who you are and like what it should be. Going back to what happened to social media and like these like social media becoming infrastructure that is in mobile, right? Like you cannot redefine the way that the bridge is built. It is built this way and functions this way. So I see the potential of like Urbit of like having a little bit of that spirit of like the flexibility and be able to like kind of build and reflect back yourself like through it. And bringing that notion, I think, back into the internet. And then to be able to build these things around like what you want them to be, what functions like you need them to function around, and the groups of people that are kind of coalescing around them. So I find that like potential really interesting. It's like there's certain things within app infrastructure that you just have to deal with as they are today. It's like you have the grid and you have the feed and you deal with it.
You're locked into it. Yeah. It's very sad. It's like, I think that even ignoring like any possible sort of like ideological or sort of like kind of political bent to Urbit that kind of indicates that, hey, this thing is meant to undercut, the world. It's kind of like it's very, to me, like just purely speaking from like creative, like a whimsy or like ideating what's fun, what's creative to work in the world. For me, it's really sad to think of computing as like an artistic form, ossifying, becoming solid, and basically just going one way, like the route of like a PDP-10, like the route of a machine that only executes C-like code, which is like how 99% of computers are these days. For me, it's like that isn't the only way. It's like saying, what's the comparison here? It's like clay, right? Like clay and ceramics, like ceramic arts can be used to make toys. You can make vessels. You can make buildings, you can make bricks, you can make so literally anything with clay, which is literally, like you can form it into whatever you want. And I think that the way computers have developed up until now, it's almost as though someone, back in the day was like, oh, clay, that thing you can do anything with, just make vessels with it, man. Just make cups out of it. That's all you're allowed to do. Like for me, that is literally where we are in the world of computing, is that we've all, for some reason, mostly money, maybe even government or military related, because let's all remember that computing in its current state is a military project. This is all just one path of computing. It didn't have to be this way. It could have gone an infinite number of directions. And if Urbit can be anything at the end of the day, and I'm speaking for Urbit here, not Tlon, but specifically Urbit, if Urbit could be anything, it could be an exercise in asking, okay, well, why can't we just try something else out? Why can't it be this other way? And let's see what happens if it goes that way. That's, I think, you reminded me that that's kind of a very crucial element to the project that I definitely believe in pretty deeply.
Beautiful. Yeah. If there isn't any other questions or any other comments, Ed, I don't want to keep you too late. I know that it's getting late in your time zone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing I'd like to end on is just maybe reinforcing that and getting kind of back to the top of the discussion. When I'm kind of drawing out this idea that, like, you as a person, you as like a rich human person who is capable of so much in your life, the fact that you are locked into very particular ways of using computers, which can literally do anything, is really sad to me. Like, it's tragic. It sucks. There really is no other way for me to kind of put it. That it's blunt, but it's what I deeply believe, is that it sucks. It's sad. And so when you're looking at what I'm kind of showing you here, which are just images of interfaces, these aren't real interfaces. Well, I guess the story that I'm trying to tell is that you should use this stuff and see if it actually kind of resonates with you, or if it's like using software that is in fact a computer that you are serving yourself. There's like almost a je ne sais quoi to it. There's a different like a mouthfeel to it. It feels different, very viscerally. Like the messages that I DM from someone in Urbit world, it's like writing like a handwritten note and like giving it to you. There's something just fundamentally different about it. And if you're interested in that, if that's actually interesting to you, I would highly recommend you try out our work and check it out. Because if it isn't already clear in how I'm communicating it, all of this, I deeply believe in it. And I think it's important to think about, who you are as a person represented digitally, and how that's, being potentially made use of by others. That's all. That's all I gotta say. Just hit us up, at our website at this QR code. I have other social media that I don't post to very often, but I'm happy to share it out in the notes to this call or however it's done. But yeah, it was fun to blab, fun to chat.
Cool. Well, thank you for like this kind of, really kind of whimsical and beautiful introduction to this thing that hopefully everyone here will try to interact with and possibly stay on and help it kind of grow and push it. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking your time.
Yeah, and if it isn't good, let us know why it isn't. It's as simple as that. Okay, cool.
All right.
Well, anyways, I'm not sure how to close out here, but I can just kind of like let it fade into black or whatever happens.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We have our next lecture coming up. Emily Elise will be happening on the 13th. So 2 weeks from today. Be on the lookout for it. Maybe we can even share it on Urbit somewhere. And then, hopefully everyone will attend that. It's going to be good.
Oh yeah, quick shout out. Galen and Karina, two people I work with. Galen's our CEO. They know Emily, so they just wanted me to say hi, Emily. That's all.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ed.